survivalist father took his baby daughter on a routine day hike through the Smoky Mountains and simply never came back, vanishing into thin air despite his decades of wilderness expertise. For 5 years, the mountains kept their silence while a mother waited for answers that never came, until 2 geology students rappelled into a remote crevice and found something carrying the one clue that would change everything. The cheap hotel art, a washed-out print of a black bear, seemed to mock Akari Tanaka from the wall. Outside the window of the small room just beyond the borders of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the sun had bled out of the sky, leaving the hazy purple twilight of an early October evening. It was 7:15 p.m. on October 5, 2018, 15 minutes past the agreed-upon return time. In the world she and her husband Kaito inhabited, a world of carabiners, topographical maps, and meticulous planning, 15 minutes was an acceptable margin of error. 60 minutes was a cause for concern. 90 minutes, the point at which Akari's own practiced calm, a skill honed over years of shared adventures, began to fray like a worn climbing rope. Her husband was not just an enthusiast, he was a disciple of the wilderness. Kaito Tanaka moved through mountains with a quiet confidence that bordered on reverence. He could read a landscape the way a librarian reads a book, understanding its language of wind patterns, animal tracks, and subtle shifts in vegetation. He was the man who packed 3 separate ways to start a fire for a simple day hike, who taught survival courses on weekends, who believed that nature didn't make mistakes, only people did. The idea of him simply getting lost was almost inconceivable, which is precisely why, as the clock on the bedside table ticked past 8:30 p.m., a cold, heavy dread began to settle in Akari's stomach. This was not a miscalculation. Something was wrong. She had their 14-month-old daughter, Luna. The thought was a sharp, painful pulse behind her eyes. Kaito's expertise was a shield, but with Luna, his caution would have been amplified tenfold. He would have factored in extra time for diaper changes, for unexpected toddler fussiness, for the simple, delightful slowness of showing his daughter a beetle on a leaf. He would have planned their one-day hike with buffers built upon buffers. He would never, ever risk being caught out after dark with his child. At 9 p.m., the dread solidified into action. Her hands were steady as she dialed the number for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park dispatch. She had refused the holiday time from her own job as a landscape architect, a decision that now felt like a cruel twist of fate. This trip was supposed to be a special father-daughter bonding experience. Now she was alone in a sterile hotel room, explaining to a calm, disembodied voice that her husband, the expert, and her baby were missing. She methodically recounted the details. Kaito Tanaka, 34, Luna Tanaka, 14 months. Their vehicle, a gray Subaru, was still in the hotel parking lot. His intended route was a less trafficked but well-established trail on the North Carolina side of the park. He was supposed to be back by 7 p.m. at the latest. The most vital piece of information she had was on her phone. She forwarded the last message she'd received, sent that morning at 10:32 a.m. It was a small burst of digital life from the trail, a handful of photos, and 2 short video clips. In one video, Kaito's voice could be heard, soft and happy, pointing out a deer to a gurgling Luna. But the anchor of the message, the image that would soon become the public face of the disappearance, was a selfie. In it, Kaito beamed, his face framed by a bright green knitted beanie and a matching neck gaiter. His sunglasses reflected the dense canopy of trees and a sliver of brilliant blue sky. On his back, nestled in the vibrant red cocoon of a state-of-the-art baby carrier, was Luna, her wide, curious eyes peering out from under the brim of a pale sun hat. They looked happy, healthy, and perfectly at ease in their element. Making good time, the accompanying text read, "The mountains are showing off today. Love you, At the park's Sugarlands Ranger Station, the report landed on the desk of Ranger Valerius Ash, a veteran with nearly 30 years of service. Ash had a face weathered like the park's own granite outcrops. He'd seen every kind of trouble the Smokies could offer, from tourists in flip-flops getting lost 100 yards from their car to seasoned hikers vanishing without a trace. He took every call seriously, but a report involving an expert and a child carried a unique weight. When an amateur gets into trouble, the cause is often predictable. When an expert like Kaito Tanaka went silent, it suggested the intervention of something sudden, powerful, and unforgiving. As he looked at the smiling selfie on his monitor, the bright, joyful colors of the family's gear stood in stark contrast to the deepening darkness outside. The search, he knew, had to begin immediately. The clock was running, and in the vast, indifferent wilderness of the Smoky Mountains, time was the one resource they could not afford to waste. The first 72 hours of the search for Kaito and Luna Tanaka were a carefully orchestrated assault against an uncooperative wilderness. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park mobilized its resources with practiced efficiency, establishing a sprawling incident command post at the trailhead where Kaito was believed to have started. The air hummed with the thrum of a helicopter's rotors, chopping through the cool morning air, its search pattern a futile gesture above a canopy so dense it was like a solid green roof. On the ground, teams of rangers and trained volunteers fanned out, their brightly colored jackets vanishing into the woods within seconds. They were fighting not just terrain, but the very nature of the Smokies. The mountains are a world of verticality and deception. Trails that look straightforward on a map can become treacherous scrambles over slick, moss-covered rocks. Ravines plunge hundreds of feet, hidden by thickets of rhododendron so tangled they are known to locals as hells. Sound doesn't travel. It's swallowed by the immense green cushion of foliage, and a shout for help might not carry more than 50 feet. The search teams moved with methodical slowness, their eyes scanning every inch of the ground for a sign. A broken branch, a dropped piece of gear, a footprint in a patch of mud. They found nothing. Kaito Tanaka, a man who lived and breathed this environment, had vanished as completely as a morning mist. By the fourth day, the search had swelled, pulling in resources from neighboring counties and volunteer search and rescue groups from across the state. They grid off square kilometers of wilderness, pushing deeper into the backcountry. But the lack of any initial clue was deeply troubling to Ranger Ash. It was one thing to not find a person. It was another to find no trace of their passage at all. Kaito, with a toddler in tow, would have left a trail. Diapers, food wrappers, the simple disturbances of moving through the woods. The absence of this evidence was a mystery in itself, a silent, nagging question at the heart of the search. Then, on the afternoon of the sixth day, came a crack of hope. A volunteer, a retired engineer named Marcus, was working a steep, muddy embankment about 300 yards off Kaito's supposed trail. His foot slipped, and as he grabbed a root to steady himself, his fingers brushed against something cold and metallic in the dirt. He carefully dug it out. It was a brass compass, heavy and ornate, its glass face cracked and its needle frozen in place. It was clearly old, a relic from another time, but it was a tangible object in a search that had so far yielded only emptiness. The discovery sent a ripple of excitement through the command post. The compass was brought to Ranger Ash, who examined it under a bright lamp. It was a beautiful, non-functional piece of history, and it sparked a compelling and what seemed at the time a perfectly logical theory. Kaito was an expert, a survivalist. What if his modern GPS, his phone, had failed? It was plausible. In the deep hollows of the Smokies, satellite and cell signals were notoriously unreliable. An expert like Kaito would undoubtedly have a backup. What if that backup was this antique compass, perhaps a family heirloom he carried for good luck? And what if, in his moment of need, he discovered it was broken? This theory was seductive because it explained the inexplicable, how a master woodsman could get so hopelessly lost. It wasn't a failure of skill, but a failure of equipment, a specific, understandable point of disaster. The narrative felt right. It painted a picture of Kaito realizing his predicament, making a desperate decision to trust a faulty instrument that led him deeper into the wilderness, away from his intended path and into oblivion. This single object reshaped the entire search effort. The grids were redrawn, the focus shifting away from Kaito's planned route and into the vast, unforgiving backcountry in the direction the compass's frozen needle pointed. For weeks, teams scoured this new territory, battling the same brutal terrain, but now fueled by a specific, if flawed, hypothesis. But the new search area yielded the same result as the old one. Nothing. Eventually, a historical society expert examined the compass and concluded it was likely from the early 20th century, a lost artifact with no connection to the present. The discovery that had provided so much hope was just another ghost in the mountains, a false lead that had consumed precious time and resources. As weeks bled into months, the official search was inevitably scaled down. The command post was dismantled, the volunteers went home, and the national news crews packed up their cameras. And in the vacuum of information, a new, crueler narrative began to take hold. It started in online forums and local gossip, a whisper that grew into a plausible, if painful, theory. Kaito Tanaka was too skilled to get lost. The reasoning went, he knew the woods too well. Therefore, he hadn't gotten lost at all. He had disappeared on purpose. The idea of an expert survivalist staging a vanishing to escape his life and live off-grid was a story as old as the mountains themselves. It cast Kaito not as a victim, but as a perpetrator of a cruel deception. This narrative shift was a second, more personal blow to Akari. She now found herself not only grieving her missing husband and child, but also defending Kaito's character against a tide of public suspicion. She knew the man she married. He was a devoted father, a loving husband. The idea that he would willingly abandon his family was a fiction she refused to entertain for a second. While the world moved on, Akari's search never ended. She used her savings to hire private investigators who re-interviewed witnesses and re-examined the scant evidence. On weekends, she would drive to the park herself. With a map spread across the hood of her car, she would methodically choose a section of trail, often one the official search had already cleared, and walk it with a slow, deliberate pace. She wasn't looking for her husband anymore. She was looking for a sign, any small thing he might have left behind. A piece of torn fabric from his shirt, a wrapper from Luna's favorite snack. She moved through the same woods that had swallowed her family, her quiet, lonely vigil, a stark contrast to the massive, failed operation that had preceded it. The case grew cold, filed away under the weight of 1,000 other park incidents, leaving only the silence of the mountains and the unwavering, heartbreaking hope of a wife who refused to let it be the final word. 5 years is a long time. It's long enough for grief to settle from a sharp, screaming wound into a dull, permanent ache. For Akari Tanaka, it was a period marked by quiet anniversaries and the fading hope that had once been a consuming fire. The national park had moved on, the case file on Kaito and Luna Tanaka, gathering a thin layer of dust in a records office. In the public consciousness, they had become a piece of Appalachian folklore, another ghost story whispered around campfires. The prevailing theory remained that of a deliberate disappearance, a narrative that had, over time, calcified into accepted fact for most. The mountains had reclaimed their own, as they always did. Then came August 1st, 2023. Far from any designated trail, in a remote, high-altitude section of the park known for its monolithic granite domes and treacherous footing, 2 figures were meticulously working their way across a vast boulder field. They were not hikers in the traditional sense. Ben Carter and Sarah Jenkins were geology students from the University of Tennessee, spending their summer on a research grant to map granite erosion patterns. Their work required them to go where others didn't, to scramble into fissures and rappel down sheer rock faces. Their world one of calipers, sample bags, and geological hammers. It was Sarah who saw it first. Perched on a high ledge to get a better vantage point for a photograph, she was scanning the complex jumble of rocks below. Her eyes, trained to notice subtle variations in color and texture, were drawn to a flash of something unnatural. Deep within a narrow, shadowed fissure between two colossal boulders, there was a patch of brilliant, insistent red. It was a color that simply did not belong in this palette of gray stone, green lichen, and brown earth. "Ben, you see that?" she called out, pointing. "Down in that crevice. Looks like a piece of trash." Ben shielded his eyes and followed her finger. From their angle, it was just a sliver of color. "Probably a torn rain jacket or something," he replied, his focus on logging a GPS coordinate. "Leave it. We're losing light." But Sarah couldn't shake it. There was something about the object's position that felt deliberate, intentional. It wasn't snagged on a branch or lying loosely on the surface. It was wedged as if it had been forced deep into the rock. Beyond the simple principle of leave no trace, a powerful curiosity took hold. They were geologists. Their profession was to uncover what was hidden. They decided to investigate. Getting to the crevice was a challenge. They had to set up a temporary anchor and rappel about 30 feet down the rock face to a narrow, precarious ledge. The fissure was dark and cool, the air still and smelling of damp stone. It was about 3 feet wide at the top, tapering as it went down. And there, about 5 feet below the ledge they were standing on, was the source of the red color. It wasn't a jacket. It was a backpack. More specifically, it was a high-end, structured child carrier backpack, the kind serious hiking parents use. Its bright red fabric was compressed, squeezed tightly by the unyielding granite walls. Black straps and buckles were visible, along with the padded frame designed to keep a child comfortable. The sight was immediately jarring. A piece of gear this expensive wasn't something a person would casually discard, and its location was baffling. This wasn't a place you could simply stumble upon. To get here required ropes, gear, and a specific reason to be in one of the park's most inaccessible areas. Who would dump this here? Ben wondered aloud, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. "This thing probably costs $500. Maybe it fell," Sarah suggested, but even as she said it, it didn't feel right. The crevice was too narrow, too protected. They spent the next hour engaged in a frustrating and delicate extraction. Ben had to lower himself further into the fissure, his body braced against the cold rock, while Sarah guided him from above. The backpack was wedged with incredible force. They had to carefully rock it back and forth, slowly working it free from the granite's grip. Finally, with a great heave, Ben pulled it loose. It was surprisingly heavy, not just from being damp, but as if it held more than just its own weight. They hauled it up onto the ledge, their hands dirty and their arms aching. Once it was out in the open, they examined it more closely. It was weathered, certainly, but not destroyed. The red fabric was faded in some spots, but largely intact. The buckles were tarnished, but functional. It was a strange, lonely object to find in such a wild place. Their initial thought was that they should just leave it, but that felt wrong. It was a significant piece of man-made debris in an otherwise pristine environment. They made the decision to haul it out. It was a cumbersome, awkward burden on top of their own gear, and the hike back to their vehicle took them well into the evening. The next morning, they drove to the Sugarlands Ranger Station. They carried the red backpack in and set it on the front counter, explaining where they had found it. The ranger on duty was an older man with tired eyes and a name tag that read, Ash. He listened patiently to their story, nodding as they described the remote location and the difficulty of the extraction. But as he looked at the backpack, a flicker of something changed in his expression. A deep, dormant memory was stirring. The specific shade of red. The brand. He had seen this backpack before. Not in person, but in a photograph. A photograph that had been taped above his desk for the better part of a year. 5 years ago. A photo of a smiling man with a green hat and a baby with wide, curious eyes. Ranger Valerius Ash felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the station's air conditioning. He turned to his computer, his fingers moving with a sudden, urgent purpose. He navigated through the digital archives to the cold case files. He typed in a name, TNAKA. The file opened, and the first thing that appeared on the screen was the selfie. Quito and Luna. And on Quito's back, the vibrant red carrier. It was an exact match. He looked from the screen to the mud-stained, weathered object on his counter, and back again. "Where did you say you found this?" he asked, his voice low and serious. The cold case wasn't cold anymore. It had just been blown wide open by 2 geology students who had simply decided not to leave a piece of trash behind in the wilderness. The rediscovery of the red baby carrier sent an electrical charge through the quiet corridors of the National Park Service and the local law enforcement agencies that had assisted in the original case. An object missing for 5 years had materialized from one of the most remote corners of the park. It was the first tangible link to Kaito and Luna Tanaka since the day they disappeared. The backpack was immediately treated not as found property, but as critical evidence. It was carefully bagged, tagged, and transported to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's forensic lab in Knoxville. The case was assigned to Dr. Ilara Vance. She was not a typical forensic scientist. Her specialty was a unique intersection of forensic anthropology and material science. She was the person they called when the how and when were just as important as the what. Her lab looked less like a crime scene unit and more like a university research facility, filled with microscopes, mass spectrometers, and climate control chambers. She was tasked with making the backpack tell its story. What had it been through? Where had it been? And for how long? Dr. Vance and her team began a methodical, painstaking examination. They photographed every angle, every stain, every tear. They took microscopic samples of the nylon fabric, the polyester stitching, the closed cell foam padding, and the plastic buckles. They analyzed the dirt and organic matter found trapped in its seams. This was not a quick process. It was a slow, scientific deconstruction. As the results of the various tests started coming in, a puzzling and deeply counterintuitive picture began to emerge. The initial assumption, held by everyone including Ranger Ash, was that the backpack had been wedged in that rock crevice for the entire 5-year period. It seemed the only logical explanation, but the science was telling a different story. The first anomaly was the UV degradation analysis. The backpack's vibrant red color, while faded, was far too bright. Dr. Vance's team used a spectrometer to measure the chemical breakdown of the dyes in the nylon fibers. They compared the results to exemplar models of the same material that had been subjected to controlled, long-term exposure to sunlight. The conclusion was inescapable. The backpack had seen at most several months of direct sunlight, not 5 years. Had it been in that exposed, high-altitude crevice for half a decade, the sun's relentless ultraviolet radiation would have bleached the red to a pale, washed-out pink or orange. Then came the analysis of the fabric's tensile strength. The nylon straps and stitching, while showing some wear, were still remarkably strong. Long-term exposure to the elements, the cycle of freezing and thawing, the constant moisture, the wind, would have made the synthetic fibers brittle. Yet the samples from the backpack retained a surprising amount of their original integrity. They had not been subjected to 5 years of harsh Appalachian weather. The most compelling piece of evidence came from the foam padding inside the shoulder straps and hip belt. Dr. Vance cut a small, discreet section from the interior of the padding. It was almost perfectly preserved. There was no sign of the microbial decay, mold, or water logging that would be inevitable had it been sitting in a damp crevice, repeatedly soaked by rain and snowmelt. The internal structure of the foam was dry and stable. Dr. Vance compiled her findings into a report that sent shock waves through the renewed investigation. She stated, with a high degree of scientific certainty, that the backpack could not have been in that rock crevice for 5 years. It simply wasn't possible. The physical evidence was clear and unambiguous. For the vast majority of the time Kaito and Luna were missing, the backpack had been kept in a protected environment, a place that was dark, dry, and had a relatively stable temperature. This revelation completely upended the investigation. The crevice wasn't the final resting place. It was a delivery point. The backpack hadn't been at the site of discovery. It had been transported there. But how? The location was remote, inaccessible. No person would have carried it there only to wedge it between two rocks. The answer had to lie with a force of nature. Investigators, led by a perplexed Ranger Ash, turned to another group of scientists, the park's own meteorologists and hydrologists. They posed a new question. Was there any natural event that could have moved an object of that size and weight and deposited it in that specific crevice? The team began an exhaustive search of meteorological records for the past year, looking for any extreme weather events localized to that sector of the park. They found it. For months prior to the backpack's discovery, in late March 2023, a massive, slow-moving thunderstorm had stalled over the high peaks. The storm had unleashed a deluge, a once-in-a-generation rain event that dropped nearly 8 inches of rain in just 3 hours. The park's records were filled with reports of the aftermath, trails washed out, footbridges destroyed, and evidence of powerful flash floods in areas that were normally dry. The flood theory began to crystallize. It was the only explanation that fit all the facts. The backpack had been safely stored in a protected location for years. Then the storm came. Flash flood waters, a raging, powerful torrent, must have ripped through its hiding place, tearing it from its sanctuary. The flood would have carried it downstream, tumbling it through the wilderness, along with rocks, logs, and other debris, until, as the waters receded, it was violently wedged into the narrow crevice where the geology students had found it. This new understanding changed everything. The location of the crevice was no longer the end of the trail. It was the beginning of a new one. The mystery was no longer what happened to Kaito and Luna, but where was this backpack hidden for 5 years? The search had a new direction. They had to stop looking at the ground and start looking at the water. They had to think like a flood, tracing the path of the water backward, upstream from the point of discovery into the wild, unknown heart of the mountains. The flood theory, as radical as it seemed, was the only one that reconciled Dr. Vance's forensic analysis with the backpack's discovery. It transformed the investigation from a cold case into an active hydrological puzzle. The red carrier was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a drift marker, a silent messenger delivered by a cataclysmic weather event. The challenge now was to reverse engineer its journey. Ranger Valerius Ash assembled a specialized team, not of trackers, but of geologists and park hydrologists, scientists who understood the violent, creative power of water in a mountain landscape. Their first step was to move their operations from a traditional map table to a high-powered computer terminal. Using detailed light detection and ranging LiDAR data, which provides a hyper-accurate 3D model of the terrain, they began to digitally reconstruct the flash flood. They fed the computer all the known variables: the location of the crevice where the backpack was found, the rainfall data from the March storm, soil saturation levels, and the known topography of the region. The goal was to create a sophisticated simulation that could model the probable flow paths of the floodwaters. It was a new frontier for a missing persons case. They weren't looking for footprints or campfire rings. They were mapping fluid dynamics. The computer models began to generate intricate branching diagrams that looked like the veins of a leaf overlaying them on the topographical map. These were the potential ghost rivers that had raged through the park for a few short violent hours. Each line represented a path the backpack could have taken. The team worked to narrow down the possibilities. They calculated the weight and buoyancy of the waterlogged backpack, factoring in its tendency to get snagged or tumble rather than float freely. This allowed them to eliminate hundreds of smaller, less powerful flow paths. The object was heavy enough that it would have likely been carried by a primary high-velocity channel. Slowly, painstakingly, the web of possibilities began to shrink. After days of running simulations and cross-referencing the data, the models consistently pointed to one specific source, a rugged, steep-walled drainage basin several miles upstream from the discovery site. It was a bowl-shaped watershed, a natural funnel for rainwater, known on old park maps by the grimly descriptive name Widow's Grief Basin. The area was a cartographer's nightmare, a chaotic jumble of cliffs, rockfalls, and nearly impenetrable vegetation. Ranger Ash felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he looked at the targeted area on the map. Widow's Grief Basin had been on the outermost periphery of the original search grid in 2018. It was so far from Kaito's intended trail, and the terrain was so notoriously difficult that it had been deemed an improbable search zone. A team had done a cursory flyover in a helicopter, but they had seen nothing and ground teams were never sent in. The probability of Kaito, an expert hiker with a child, ending up in such a punishing and out-of-the-way location had seemed astronomically low. But the water did not lie. The flood path was a clear, undeniable scientific conclusion. The focus of the entire operation shifted with a sudden, palpable intensity. This was their chance. It was perhaps their last chance. Ranger Ash began assembling a new ground team, but this team was different from the large-scale volunteer effort of 5 years ago. He handpicked a small group of the park's most elite specialists, a technical climbing expert, a wilderness paramedic, and a handful of seasoned backcountry rangers who were as comfortable on a vertical rock face as they were on a paved path. Their mission was redefined. They were no longer searching for a person in a general area. They were searching for a specific type of place within a scientifically defined zone. Their new primary objective, as Ash briefed them, was to locate the original hiding place of the backpack. Think like a survivor, he told them, his voice grave. If you were injured, if you needed to get out of the elements with a child, where would you go? We're not looking for just anywhere. We're looking for a shelter, a cave, a deep overhang, a protected rock shelter, someplace dark and someplace dry. Armed with the new hydrological maps and a renewed, if somber, sense of purpose, the team prepared to venture back into the Smokies. They were heading into Widow's Grief Basin, an area the original investigation had dismissed to follow the ghost of a flood back to its source. They were looking for the place where the red backpack had waited in silence for 5 long years. The entry into Widow's Grief Basin was arduous. There were no trails here, not even faint game paths. The team moved through a world that seemed actively hostile to human passage. They scrambled over enormous slick boulders slick with ancient moss, pushed through claustrophobic thickets of mountain laurel, and rappelled down short, steep cliffs into creek beds choked with debris. Every foot of progress was earned. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, a primal scent that felt untouched by time. The hydrological maps guided their general direction, keeping them within the flood's primary drainage channel. But the microterrain required constant improvisation. They focused their search on the rock formations lining the basin. They were looking for the specific geological features that could offer refuge. Solution caves carved by water, deep recesses under fallen boulders, and ledges shielded by natural overhangs. For 2 days they found nothing. They explored a dozen shallow alcoves and small caves, but all were damp, exposed, or showed no signs of human habitation. The optimism that had fueled the start of the mission began to wane under the sheer physical and mental toll of the search. On the third day, the team was working along the base of a sheer 100-foot granite cliff face. A curtain of gnarled, ancient rhododendron, thick as a wall, grew against the rock. It was the kind of feature most would pass by, assuming it was solid vegetation. But one of the younger rangers, a man named Leo, had a climber's eye for subtle variations in the rock behind the greenery. He thought he saw a shadow, a patch of deeper darkness behind the leaves that didn't look right. "Hold up," he called out, pointing. "Something back there." It took two of them 10 minutes with machetes to hack a narrow path through the dense, woody tangle of rhododendron. As they cut away the final branches, they revealed it. A dark, narrow opening in the cliff face, about 4 feet high. It was a true rock shelter, a horizontal fissure in the granite, its entrance almost perfectly concealed by the thick vegetation. The floor of the shelter was about 5 feet above the basin floor, on a natural ledge. It was dry. Ranger Ash felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the right kind of place. He was the first to pull himself up onto the ledge and peer inside. The shelter was not deep, perhaps 15 feet from front to back, and about 20 feet wide. The air inside was cool and still. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the opening, he saw it. In the far back corner of the shelter, arranged in a way that was unmistakably human, were the skeletal remains of an adult male. The scene was somber and eerily peaceful. The skeleton was mostly intact, positioned on its side as if in sleep. There was no sign of a struggle, only a profound stillness. A quick, respectful examination by the team's paramedic revealed catastrophic fractures to the right femur and pelvis, injuries consistent with a fall from a significant height. The story began to tell itself. Kaito had likely fallen from the cliff top above, survived, and with his last reserves of strength and expertise, crawled into this hidden shelter to escape the elements. Here, he had ultimately succumbed to his injuries. A later comparison with dental records would provide the definitive, heartbreaking confirmation. The remains belonged to Kaito Tanaka. The team conducted a slow, reverent search of the small space. They found the tattered remains of Kaito's clothing and the rusted metal frame of his internal frame backpack, its fabric long since consumed by insects and rodents. But of Luna, or the red baby carrier that had started this final chapter, there was no sign. The shelter held the story of Kaito's last days, but it seemed Luna's fate was a separate and still missing chapter. As the forensic team began their meticulous work, carefully documenting and collecting the remains, one of the technicians, sifting through the compacted dirt floor near the entrance, felt his trowel strike something hard. It wasn't a rock. He carefully brushed away the soil. The object was metal, dark with corrosion, and had a short wooden handle. As he worked it free from the dirt, he realized it was some kind of tool. It was a small, hand-forged hoe with a distinct, curved blade. It was heavy and crudely made, clearly not a piece of modern, lightweight hiking equipment. It was a tool designed for digging, for prying. Ranger Ash came over to look. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and examined the object. The most peculiar feature was the handle. It was wrapped in a complex, almost decorative pattern with faded green electrical tape. The wrapping was precise and unique. Ash had seen thousands of pieces of gear in his career, both legal and illegal, but this was different. He stared at the tool, a cold, dawning recognition creeping into his mind. He had seen this exact style of wrapping before. Years ago, on gear he had confiscated from a local couple he'd repeatedly run into for park infractions. Minor things like camping without a permit, but they always carried tools like this. They were suspected of being ginseng poachers. The tool was a sengo, an instrument used exclusively for the illegal harvest of wild American ginseng, a root more valuable by weight than gold in some markets. And it absolutely did not belong to Kaito Tanaka. The discovery of the Sengo shattered the tragic accident narrative. Kaito had not been alone. Someone else had been here in this shelter. The investigation, which had just found a resolution, was instantly reborn with a host of new, terrifying questions. This was no longer just a search and rescue mission that had ended in tragedy. It had become a potential crime scene. The discovery of the Sengo was like a key turning in a lock that no one knew existed. It fundamentally and irrevocably altered the narrative of Kaito Tanaka's death. He was no longer a solitary victim of the mountain's indifference. He had company in his final moments. The focus of the investigation pivoted with whiplash-inducing speed from a tragedy to a potential homicide, or at the very least, a criminal case involving failure to render aid. The rock shelter was sealed, and a full forensic team was brought in by helicopter to process every square inch of the site. The central piece of evidence was the hoe. In the sterile environment of the lab, it was analyzed for prints and DNA. But years in the damp soil had yielded nothing conclusive. Its true value lay in its unique construction, specifically the handle. Ranger Ash's memory of the distinctive green electrical tape wrapping became the single most important lead in the reborn case. He spent hours in the park's dusty evidence archives pulling old files on known poachers and individuals cited for illegal activities in the park around the 2018 timeframe. Ginseng poaching is a secretive and often generational trade in Appalachia. It's a cash business built on local knowledge and a deep distrust of authority. Poachers are notoriously difficult to catch. They know the woods as well as the rangers, move like ghosts, and leave little trace. But they often have signature habits, a certain way of tying a knot, a preference for a particular brand of smokeless tobacco, or in this case, a unique way of wrapping a tool handle. After 2 days of poring over aging paperwork and faded Polaroids of confiscated equipment, Ash found it. A file from 2016, a minor citation for an illegal campfire. The subjects were a local couple, Quentin and Isla Mayfair. Stapled to the report was a photo of the gear they'd had with them. A small sack, a water bottle, and a digging tool with a handle wrapped in the exact same pattern of green electrical tape. It was an undeniable match. The Mayfairs were known to Ash, though not for anything major. They were part of the region's fabric of fiercely independent, often impoverished families who lived on the park's periphery and sometimes saw its resources as their own. They had been suspected of poaching for years, but were too clever to ever be caught with a significant amount of ginseng. The investigation now had names. A search of public records revealed that Quentin and Isla Mayfair had abruptly sold their small rented property and moved out of state in the spring of 2019. Approximately 6 months after Kaito and Luna disappeared. The timing was deeply suspicious. Felt less like a simple relocation and more like a flight. Investigators from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation took over, using digital breadcrumbs to track the couple's path. They had moved first to West Virginia, then to a rural corner of Kentucky. Their trail was not deliberately hidden, but it was faint, the trail of people living on the margins, paying for things in cash and avoiding official documentation. After several weeks of painstaking work, they were located. The Mayfairs were living in a small rundown house at the end of a long dirt road in a remote county in eastern Kentucky. And they were not alone. Neighbors reported that the couple had a daughter, a quiet, shy girl about 6 years old. They were known to be intensely, almost obsessively protective of her. The existence of the child sent a wave of tense, almost unbearable speculation through the investigative team. The age was right. Could it be? Was it possible that Luna Tanaka was not dead, but had been living with this couple for 5 years? The situation was now extraordinarily delicate. If the child was Luna, a heavy-handed, aggressive approach could be catastrophic for her. She would have no memory of Kaito or Akari. The Mayfairs were, for all intents and purposes, the only parents she had ever known. A sudden, violent separation could inflict a new and profound trauma. A plan was carefully formulated. It would be a soft approach. A small team of investigators, including Ranger Ash, whose familiar weathered face might be less intimidating than that of a city detective, would make the trip to Kentucky. They wouldn't go in with sirens and a warrant. They would go in with a question. They would knock on the door, present the facts as they knew them, and see how the Mayfairs reacted. The centerpiece of their strategy was not a weapon or a warrant, but a single object sealed in an evidence bag, the hand-forged Sengo with its distinctive green-taped handle. They were banking on the hope that the sight of this ghost from their past would be enough to break 5 years of silence. The drive to eastern Kentucky was a quiet, tense affair. The landscape shifted from the sharp peaks of the Smokies to the rolling, worn-down hills of coal country. The house was exactly as the records described. A small white clapboard structure at the end of a rutted dirt lane surrounded by untamed woods. A few rusted toys were scattered in the overgrown yard. As the investigators' unmarked car pulled up, a thin curtain twitched in a front window. Ranger Ash, flanked by 2 TBI agents in plain clothes, walked up the creaking wooden steps and knocked on the door. After a long moment, the door opened a few inches, held by a chain. A man's face appeared in the gap. It was Quentin Mayfair. He was thinner than Ash remembered, his face etched with a permanent look of weary suspicion. "We're not buying anything," Quentin said, his voice flat. "We're not selling," one of the agents replied calmly. "We're here to talk about an incident in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park from October of 2018. The flicker of fear in Quentin's eyes was unmistakable. "Don't know what you're talking about. We ain't been there in years." He tried to close the door, but the agent put a hand flat against it, not forcing it, but holding it in place. From inside the house, a woman's voice called out, sharp with anxiety, "Quentin, who is it?" Isla Mayfair appeared behind her husband. She looked older than her years, her face pale and drawn. It was then that the second agent slowly and deliberately raised the clear evidence bag he was holding. Inside, resting on a sterile white background, was the Song-Ho. The faded green electrical tape seemed to glow with unspoken history. The effect on Isla was instantaneous and devastating. The color drained from her face. Her hand flew to her mouth and a choked sob escaped her lips. The carefully constructed wall of denial she and her husband had lived behind for 5 years crumbled to dust in that single moment. Quentin's own defiant posture collapsed as he saw his wife's reaction. He unlatched the chain and stumbled back into the living room. Ash and the agent stepped inside. The house was sparsely furnished but clean. A little girl with dark hair and wide, solemn eyes peeked out from behind a doorway before being gently shooed back by Isla. It was Isla who spoke first, her voice a torrent of words held back for half a decade. Through racking sobs, she confessed the whole story. They had been in the basin that day, digging for ginseng, a good haul that they hoped would get them through the winter. They were packing up to leave when they heard a cry. Not an animal, but a human. They followed the sound and found Kaito at the base of the cliff. His leg bent at an impossible angle, his face ashen with shock and pain. And next to him, wrapped in his jacket, was the baby Luna, crying from cold and fear, but miraculously unharmed. Kaito, delirious and knowing he was dying, had begged them, not for himself, but for his daughter. "Save her," he had pleaded, pushing the baby towards them. "Please, take her. Save my baby." They had panicked. They were there illegally. They were terrified of being implicated in his death, of being sent to prison. In a moment of desperate, flawed reasoning, they made a choice. They took the child. They took the red baby carrier, which held diapers and formula. They left Kaito with their water bottle and fled, scrambling out of the basin in a blind terror. In their haste, Quentin had dropped his Sengo in the shelter. They didn't realize it was gone until they were miles away. They drove all night, the silent, wide-eyed baby in the back seat. They told themselves they would drop her at a hospital or a church, but they never did. Days turned into weeks. They were poor, childless, and had fallen into a strange, desperate love with the little girl who had fallen into their lives. They gave her a new name, raised her as their own, and lived every single day under the shadow of what they had done. Quentin and Isla Mayfair were taken into custody without resistance. Their daughter was gently taken into the care of Child Protective Services, a specialist explaining that her parents had to go away for a while. A DNA sample was taken from the child and rushed for testing. The call came to Akari Tanaka 2 days later. The voice on the other end of the line told her that her husband's remains had been found. But before she could fully process that wave of old, familiar grief, the voice delivered a second impossible piece of news. They had found her daughter. Luna was alive. The case was officially solved. But for Akari, a new and profoundly complex journey was just beginning. The reunion she had dreamed of for years would be with a 6-year-old girl who did not know her. A child whose entire world was about to be turned upside down. Justice had been served, but the resolution was a mosaic of sorrow and hope, a testament to the enduring, complicated consequences of a single, panicked decision made high in the lonely heart of the Smoky Mountains.